If you're a lawyer who wants to podcast, check out legalpodcasting.com.
This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is another episode of New Jersey Criminal Podcast. We have attorney Derek DeCosmo here. He's going to be talking to us about immigration law. Derek, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Yeah, sure. My name is Derek DeCosmo. My office is in Camden, New Jersey. I've been practicing immigration law for almost 20 years. I've been teaching criminal immigration law at Rutgers Law School since 2016. I was formerly the chairman of the New Jersey chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And I also spent some time in Congress. I was a deputy chief of staff in a different life where immigration was one of the issues that was in my portfolio, and it was really what started my career in immigration law.
Shit. Derek, I was going to jump right into, let's talk about current events and everything. I think it would be better, though, can you tell us how immigration law has changed over the last, century? Just to premise it, my great-grandfather came through Ellis Island, right? Came from Italy, and then immigrated into New Jersey, right? How has that process, back then, tell me how it differed from back then versus now.
Sure. Now, that's a great question. One I've dealt with a lot over the last 20 years, which is, even within my own family, people saying, well, Derek, our family did it the right way. And I say to them, because my family were Italian immigrants that came in the early 1900s, that went to the coal mines of Pennsylvania before getting jobs at places like RCA that used to exist in Camden and Campbell Soup Company and some RCA records, those kinds of places. But essentially what I say to you and to them is that you couldn't illegally immigrate back then because we had a completely open policy. And as long as you weren't traveling with some type of disease, of which most of the time you would just be quarantined a little while before then being admitted into the United States. So we had an open policy from the beginning and, certainly halfway through the 1900s, and because we needed to populate this country, right? We have a large country and we needed to populate it. So the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is kind of what we work under, came in the 1950s, and there have been some major changes to it in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, and I'll briefly explain those. But fundamentally, my client from Mexico who came by themselves with a few dollars and built themselves up financially here and otherwise and sent for the rest of the family to join was the same thing that grandparents and great-grandparents did. It's just now the pathways to becoming having lawful status in the United States are extremely limited, and they weren't then. But essentially, to kind of get to where we are in 2025, we have to kind of briefly speak about some things that happened in the 1980s and the 1990s. So in the 1980s, there was large consensus among all political parties that there needed to be some more options immigration-wise, because our system of bringing people in wasn't keeping up with essentially, most importantly, the economic needs of the United States. So in the 1980s, when Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, and President Ronald Reagan was in office, they came to an agreement on an amnesty bill that allowed people, largely farm workers, who came without status or came with a visa that expired, they gave them a pathway to permanent residency. Essentially how it works is you either come...
That was under the Reagan administration, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Yes, that was the 1986 amnesty. And that allowed for a lot of people to become permanent residents and ultimately become United States citizens. But after about 10 years, there was, pushback about that law in that there was not enough consequence for violations of the immigration law. So in 1996, then Speaker Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton signed very restrictive immigration law that really, and that's still the law that we operated under, but essentially it greatly limited how how people can lawfully come to the United States, how people can obtain permanent status once they're here. And they created a lot of additional grounds for deportation. And another word I want to use is inadmissibility. So if somebody's here legally, you have to be deported. You're deported under a ground of deportation. If you are trying to obtain a status, you can be barred and also deported if you are subject to a ground of inadmissibility. So they greatly expanded those definitions. They created the provisions for mandatory detention of certain individuals convicted of crimes. And that's, what we work under. They did put a temporary amnesty in that program because they knew that this new bill was going to be very restrictive. So there was a type of amnesty in that bill, but that sunsetted or that expired on April 2001. So that expires. And again, these things limit the number of individuals that can come in and out of the country. And so again, subsequent to that, we had the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and there were some additional provisions put in the law, mainly targeting asylum seekers, because if you remember the first World Trade Center bombing, that was orchestrated by an imam who came to the United States who was trying to get political asylum. And while that case was pending out, he was a part of that first attempt to take down the towers. So after the towers went down a second time, although most of the people involved were here on student visas, they were have training at flight schools and things like that, they restricted the laws a little bit more. George W. Bush recognized the need for immigrant labor, and because, for example, the main type of visa for immigrants, we can talk about the H-1B. That's the one I think that's more popularly discussed politically nowadays, but the H-2B is your temporary work visa. The H-2Bs and H-2As, and these are people that are coming to work in landscaping, work in construction, pick vegetables on a farm, etc. But it's capped number. There's only 60,000 of those visas for the whole United States. So it's never been indexed to the relative economic need of the United States. For example, obviously your show is based in New Jersey. New Jersey could probably use all 60,000 for the number of people they employ at the shore each summer, because most of those folks are foreign-born individuals. So what George W. Bush wanted to do was to create a temporary work program and overhaul the immigration system. And that actually only failed by one vote. But you had a lot of bipartisan support for that bill. It broke down in the end. Since that point, whether it's the Obama administration, first Trump administration, Biden administration, or now second Trump administration, the immigration issue has largely become a political football, right? That both parties really want to use, where prior to that, for the decades prior to that, there was a lot of bipartisan, bipartisan support for certain things in the immigration law. So that kind of brings us up to today. I don't want to, I'll let you ask follow up.
So, essentially then the law is largely the same since 9/11. The changes, like the laws kind of remain the same since then.
Yeah, and more so 5 years before that, the 1996 bill was the real big change, and it was a flawed bill, which is why you continue to have, depending on your perspective, problems. Right now, another problem though that you have, which I think kind of has led us to what we're seeing today, which is a strong push towards immigration enforcement, is that for the majority of my career, my 20-year career, you maybe had about 400,000 people cross the border each year without status. You maybe had around 300,000 who would come on, say, a tourist visa and not leave. So roughly a number between 700,000 and 1 million. But each year, 1 million people would obtain permanent status. So the overall number of undocumented people in the United States, that number kind of hovered just right around that number they talk about a lot, which is like 11 million people, right? And that stayed true up until the Biden administration, unfortunately, where it seems like the number of people in a non-permanent type status, some literally brought by the Biden administration through some executive actions and then people coming over the southern and northern borders, at least 3 million people a year. So we had a static number of about 11 million undocumented people for decades. And probably the number as of today, I wouldn't be surprised because they haven't really released the numbers, but I'm not going to be surprised if it's between 22 and 25 million. And that's a difference, right? Because the country very easily, almost without people even noticing, could assimilate the number of people coming in, more people getting legal. But where you start to see the pressure points of this is in places like school districts, right? That all of a sudden overnight they need 20 more bilingual staff to deal with students and their parents. And I am an immigration attorney. I've worked in this field for decades. I am very much pro-immigrant. I think that there is the net positives of immigration far outweigh any of the struggles or the setbacks. But the things that people are frustrated about, that kind of really, the election came down to this issue. I mean, people can talk about what they like or dislike about President Trump or what they didn't like or liked about Kamala Harris, but the turning point issue was immigration and the consensus of the majority of Americans that they wanted to see some action on it, because the pressure points that they're seeing were difficult, whether it was school districts, things with healthcare. The other problem is that until the Biden administration, my clients, they never got rental assistance or it didn't exist. It didn't exist, which is why I could always say, look, my clients are here working, doing the jobs that need to get done, building families, starting businesses, very much care about security as well, within their communities and their schools, et cetera. And they're not getting anything for it, and they're paying taxes. But, we saw what we saw with Hotel Roosevelt in New York, where, the city of New York is funding housing for people for very extended period of time, and so on and so on. So it became, the political issue it is, and then a perception that immigrants are committing a higher level of crimes, which data-wise, that's not true. The amount of crimes committed by the immigrant population is lesser than the Native American born population. But this perception of it then, of this crime issue, led to 2 weeks ago the passage of the Lake and Riley Act. And the Lake and Riley Act is essentially expands upon the 1996 law that I mentioned, that it categorizes more people as the government being required to detain them mandatorily without the option to get bail.
So let's come back to that one. So just to recap then, you're saying that back before the 1950s, when the modern sort of framework of immigration was passed, that there was basically get on a boat, sail to America, and if you clear like the medical screening, you're in, right?
Yeah.
Is that so?
Yes.
Did you have to bring anything with you, like when you came? Like, did you have to have a certain amount of money? Did you have to have identification? Like what was there any sort of like minimum requirement?
No. There really wasn't. Anything.
And you became then like a permanent resident, and then you worked towards citizenship, or how did that work?
Yeah, there was an interim. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but there was.
You didn't practice law in the 1940s?
Yeah, there was some type of a period before you became a citizen or could be sworn in as a citizen. Currently now you have to be a permanent resident, or what the colloquial thing is to say a green card holder. You have to be in that status for 5 years before you can apply for new citizenship.
So now, present day now, does it differ? Does the process differ in how to come here legally, like based on what country you're from?
That's a great question. There isn't anything that favors necessarily one country over another. I mean, in practical terms, there are, but in terms of the written law, there isn't a faster pathway, except for when, individual presidents use their executive authority to carve up some exceptions. The 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 the, the Biden administration greatly expanded two things. One is temporary protected status. So if you're from a country where there's a natural disaster, a civil war, et cetera, the president through the head of Homeland Security can designate. So for example, earthquake in Haiti, right? The president can designate a period of, if you were already in the United States, we're going to give you this temporary protected status for a period of 18 months until things might get better in your country and you can return. However, from the original designations, and some of them go back to the 1990s, they just kept getting extended. President Trump in his first term tried to eliminate them. There were legal battles. And so not only did the Biden administration bring them back, he added designations. He also created a parole program specific to four countries, which were Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And this to
And
me,
what's the parole program?
I'm going to explain it, and it's really the direct causal relationship, I think, to the kind of national backlash that led to really spurred on President Trump's election for this second term. So essentially, the temporary protected status, there's some controversy about it, but not much because those people were already here. The Biden parole program for the four countries I mentioned was literally, hey, have somebody in the United States fill out a piece of paper, send it to us, and we'll basically give you a visa, which is a parole, but the parole and visa are very similar, and also a work card, which I have clients here who have not committed any crime, who are here 20 plus years working, paying taxes. They don't have a legal entry to the United States. They don't have a work card. And so what happens when, and I'll say this, and I think I'd have colleagues that would challenge me on it, but there was certainly among the people that got these countries that got designated this special parole, more of a sense of entitlement when they, hey, I'm here now. Well, where's my rental assistance? Where's my cell phone? Where's my this, and this? Because, they had no stake in the United States. It's not like it's my wife filling out this little piece of paper to send to the government so that I can be paroled in.
And which where was it again? I heard Cuba or the other.
Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And then to what President Trump campaigned on, yeah, Venezuela, there's wonderful Venezuelans, but you also did get a lot of their criminals because it was a way for their president to get rid of people. And and so this parole program, which Trump has eliminated, but there is still probably about 1 million people that were able to come in on it, and now they're here. So
what was the logic behind it? Like, in favor of it anyway?
I think that I've pondered that myself because the thing of it is that clearly people on the pro-immigration side, the activist side, had to be advocating, lobbying the administration for this. To me, the Haitians that were here already were still under this temporary protected status. And, and so to say, well, now we're going to bring in more people just because, what I think the thought process of the Biden administration was that there was a high number of Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans and Cubans showing up on the southern border. And that was a bad optic because the numbers, the flow of the southern border is a problem to try to take stress off of that border.
Yeah, just
fly. We're gonna give you
say,
we're gonna roll out the red carpet and fly in. And again, that has led to some problems for sure, But that's where we are. So now President Trump has ended those programs, but as I said, you have at least 1 million people here from those programs, plus this many millions that have come across the border. So, we'll see what's going to happen. I know what is happening currently. But the other problem too, which was unfortunate of President Biden creating those programs, was that if, let's say, I married somebody from anywhere in the world, right? Whether it's I married somebody from Brazil or Britain, wherever, instead of it taking a couple months for my wife to come as a as a permanent resident.
I know
It
all about this one, Derek. My brother
take
waited a year and a half to.
Well, and a lot of people are waiting close to 4 years because they didn't hire any more people to do these parole applications. They probably received about 2 million of them, processed almost a million. So they took officers that were working on the normal stuff that
Yeah.
immigration, the what's called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, what they're supposed to be working on, had to stop working on it to work on things for this program. So, it led to a lot of frustration and, quite frankly, resentment among people that are trying to engage in the process.
And those are people essentially that just regular, a lot of them U.S. citizens applying to have their wives come over, family members come over, parents come over.
Pretty much all of them U.S. citizens. I'm not even talking about employment stuff. I'm talking about
Yeah.
U.S. citizens
Right.
trying to bring
Right.
their husband, wife, and kids. Yeah.
Were they giving more, were the cases you just spoke about, the parole cases, were they giving them more, like, were they getting processed quicker than the other ones, or were they in the same queue?
So, no, definitely separate queue because they're separate applications and kind of applications go by queue. But if when they started these programs, I'm like, at that time, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, hadn't completed restaffing that they lost from COVID. Because what happened during COVID was that a lot of immigration service officers, if they were retirement eligible, they just took the retirement. So the Biden administration started with in need of about 25,000 immigration agents as replacements to the existing. So they certainly did work on that, but at the same time, you create new programs where there's not new people to deal with them. You're taking people off of existing family-based immigration cases and other type cases to process these applications, which then backlogged everything even more, a backlog that we're still dealing.
Are you seeing, like, just in a couple months of the change in administration, are they addressing these shortages? I mean, obviously they ended those programs. I imagine that'll have some impact, but are they doing anything to address the existing backlog, like hiring for people?
Well, I mean, that remains to be seen, right? I think that, the good thing about immigration is that it is funded by the application fees. So this isn't now things like border security, things like that, that's obviously federal funding. So essentially, because they have paying customers, right? They're always trying to be staffed appropriately. And because they're not going to Congress, hey, I need X amount of dollars because our filing fees fund it, they have that flexibility. I don't know what priority level processing applications in a timely fashion is going to be for this administration. I think that is something to be seen. I think that it's better for everyone for these things to be done quickly and efficiently. So I'm hoping because of that, maybe we'll see things get more reasonable because it's like, I mean, I do Zooms with couples and it's like, okay, we're ready to be together forever. I finished my master's degree in Great Britain and my husband here, blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, we're looking at about 4 years, that's not reasonable for people trying to start their lives or be reunited with immediate family. I'm not even talking about me trying to bring my sister or my brother. I'm talking immediate family. I'm talking wives and
Like
kids.
wives, parents, kids. Yeah.
So we'll see what's going to happen with that to be determined.
Now let's switch gears a little bit. So we're in 2025. Walk me through the different processes in which somebody who is living abroad says, you know what, I want to immigrate to the United States. Like, what are their options and like how exactly does the process work?
Yeah, so that's a great question because pretty much every one of your questions has an answer because there's problems that lead to a problem that we have or that or perceived problems that we have with our system. So if I'm outside of the United States, if I have an immediate family member, like such as a spouse, they can petition for me.
Right.
We have student visas. They're not
And
permanent.
just to pause you 1 second, those applications, when you're talking about a spouse, like, so long as there's no fraud in the relationship aspect, I mean, that's pretty much a guaranteed thing to eventually get brought over here. Is that fair?
Yeah, as long as there's no fraud and also criminal history.
Criminal, right.
But yeah, no, I mean, essentially, if it's a legitimate relationship, whether it's with the spouse or with the child, et cetera, that's your primary way. There are visas, there are student visas, there are work visas, but the problem is that um, again, we don't have our work visas indexed to economic need, never have. They're just arbitrary numbers. And so a lot of times we have a lot more need than we have visas available. So that's not always an option or a good option. And
Right.
then largely what you have is, you know, folks who just want to be here, right? So you get large numbers of people claiming asylum or trying to come to the United States and claim asylum who really don't qualify for asylum as that's written.
And to highlight that a little bit more and understand a little bit more, like when someone just wants to come here to live here, right? Like there's no vehicle for that. Like they have to get like they have to like fit into one of the categories to come here, and most of those categories are: do you have family here? Do you have some sort of like expertise? You're going to come work here that we can't do, get that anywhere else, right? And then like other than asylum, what other boxes are
I
there?
mean, those are really the three main. Those are the three main buckets, right? Those are the three main buckets. They have limited stuff for like investors, but I still kind of group that under the whole work one way or another. Either you have some great, I don't do employment work now, but I used to, and one of our clients was Rowan University, so we'd be bringing in these very talented professors, or a lot of IT companies. But then we'd also have you know, I'm not going to say the name, but I own a big farm and I need, 35 people a year. And, they would have to the unskilled jobs, they would have to try to find by law, and it's a monitored program. They'd have to try to find US born workers to fill those jobs first. But, it was amazing when I did that kind of work. You put the ads out, paper everywhere, you would get nobody to apply to pick vegetables. You just wouldn't get anybody. But those are the main buckets. So a lot of people, if they don't have that immediate family member and they lack the professional expertise to be sponsored, and again, the business visas are capped anyway, there's not enough of them, so people just try to flood in and take their shot. And if they get apprehended, a lot of them will try to make some type of asylum claim, and that's where we are now. Which is why I made it a point to reference George W. Bush's guest worker program that he proposed and came close to getting through, which was going to be like a 3-year work visa, potentially renewable, because most people want to just come here, work, and go home. Not every one of them is looking to totally build their life here. But we don't have, and we never have since they really started the statutory scheme, we don't have immigration laws that match what we need in terms of security, economic need, familial need, because families need to be together. We just don't. And so what happens is, you're either trying to force a square peg into a round hole to try to fit yourself into some category that maybe you do or don't qualify for, or you're just rolling the dice. Let me get there. Let me work in the United States, and until it catches up to me. And
Yeah.
that's what happens.
And so let's talk more, I guess, about the asylums process, because I think that one is pretty much the biggest thing that comes up in anytime anyone's talking about illegal immigration. I mean, would you agree, right? That's the one that is obviously coming up almost every single time someone walks over that border, doesn't have a visa to come here. That's their only choice, right? Like other than to just say, all right, you got me, I'm going to go home now.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, no, it's perfect, right? Because I do, many consultations a day, and people will be like, well, okay, I came in 6 months ago. I did get stopped, so they're telling me I'm gonna have to see a judge in the future. What are my options? I'm like, you don't have any. You don't qualify for it. Well, what do you mean? It's like, you don't qualify for anything. You should have known that when you kind of took your shot to come up to the United States. Now to top it off, you entered illegally, which is a problem. But yeah,
So they can't claim asylum.
so they do, but let me just give you some examples. Haiti's never been stable. period, right? And I get it that it's really unstable now and you have gangs running things. Um, that, that's not really the definition of political asylum. Nicaragua, the same kind of thing. The economic crisis, Ecuador, a lot of things are just countries that are just not stable. And yes, you might be suffering some violence there, but unfortunately, for better or worse, our laws, which are international laws because they go back to the Geneva Convention, is that to be truly qualified for political asylum, the harm that you're suffering has to have been politically motivated, politically, ethnically. But this whole like my country can't get its act together and it's not safe and we have no economic opportunity, which is the real reason that most people comes for economic opportunity, even if they suffered some type of a violent episode. But just kind of being from a dangerous place,
Yeah.
is an asylum. And quite frankly, I say to people all the time, well, there's sections of Philadelphia I'm not going to walk around in. You know what I mean? Because et cetera. Obviously, it's worse in certain countries, but there's crime everywhere and violence everywhere, unfortunately. But when people, because they can't possibly qualify for anything else, they take their shot with submitting an asylum application.
And just so everyone is aware, like, what is the actual black letter like legal standard for being granted asylum? What do you have to prove?
So you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution based on political opinion, your race, your national origin, your membership in a particular social group, which that's or your religion. So the membership in a particular social group is kind of where all the litigation lies, right? Because we have Venezuelans that it's well documented that they were actively protesting that government, and that government was actively looking for them. Like, that's your true political asylum case, right? But most people, they try to get it under social group, which social group could be, I am a LGBTQ person living in this country that oppresses, my life, right? Because I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. Some try to, as attorneys, we try to get creative with what might legally qualify as a social group. But essentially what the legal definition is, it's supposed to be an immutable characteristic of someone. So it's a characteristic in you that can't be changed, right? And if you're suffering violence because of it, and the state is either the sponsor of that violence or turning a blind eye to it, not enforcing any law to protect you, then you could potentially qualify for political asylum.
How do you, if you're going in there, well, let me back up a sec. You file for asylum, right? What's the judicial process then of litigating? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. So this is where things kind of get even messier, right? Because if you're stopped on the border, there's a law that you can be summarily deported, right? You can be given, not seeing a judge. It's called expedited removal. A border patrol agent can deport you unless you express some type of credible fear of being returned to your country. And so if you express that threat and you pass what they call a credible fear interview, which the standard's low on that, your case is deferred to the immigration court. And at some point, you'll be scheduled in front of an immigration judge. But what has happened, and this has continually happened since Obama, and then really, really happened a lot under Biden, is that people come, they're detained. Okay, you're going to have court. What city are you going to? I'm going to go to Camden, New Jersey. Okay, you're going to go to the Newark Immigration Court. Here's when and where you got to go. The problem is that, and this goes back to 2013, like I said under Obama, is that the intention is always let the judges adjudicate these cases first, because if these people go into the normal course of the court's flow, it could several years before a judge actually gets to them. And then what's happening during those years, right? Then people are building equities, right? They're having kids, etc. But each administration has tried and failed to deal with the newest, most recent arrivals first. I think one of the things the Trump administration is really going to try to focus on is dealing with people first before they've really set up their lives in the United States. immigration court was always slow, but for most of my career, I would generally be telling clients like, okay, we're going to go through this court process and we should be done in like 2 or 3 years. 2013 happened when we started really seeing numbers increase under the Obama administration. That, started looking like, okay, it's going to be like a 3 to 5 year process. But now it's like 7 to 10 years. It's ridiculous. I just finished a deportation case for somebody a couple weeks ago that started 18 years ago.
What makes it take that long? What's do you just get like an email from the court like, hey, we don't have enough people, like we don't have enough time
Well,
to deal with this, and we're
yeah.
pushing it 6 months out? Like,
Well, yeah, no, I mean, so what happens is that one is that you might have had a million cases in the immigration courts throughout the country for most of my career going on at one time. I think by the end of this fiscal year, that number is going to look something more like 7 or 8 million, right? So there's not enough courts, there's not enough judges, there's not enough government prosecutors to do these things. And when cases get kicked down the road, then the judge now, well, that judge is now retired. So now we have a new judge. You got to go back to the beginning of their calendar and start through the process again. So I mean, that's generally what happens. But they want the judges doing like, at least 2 or 3 full deportation hearings a day. But things happen, right? Courts get delayed. Judge calls out sick. There's just a million things that happen. So
there's more cases coming in than going out because you're
exactly
only doing out.
right,
Even in the best day, you're only doing
right,
like
and
a couple, 4 or 5 a day for that judge, and then there's probably, I don't know what the numbers are now, but certainly over the last
well,
3 years, they were coming in faster than they could even handle.
no, absolutely. Like I said, I think the court's national docket's going to be somewhere like 8 million, 7, 8 million by the end of this fiscal year. And then the problem now with the Trump administration, one thing that the Biden and Obama administrations allowed was they allowed for prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors we could work cases out. Like, okay, well, you don't quite qualify for this, but you're not breaking the law as long as you're not committing crimes, et cetera. We're going to close out your case either temporarily or permanently, stay out of trouble, and we won't see you again. So that at least allowed the judges, the government prosecutors, and on our bar to at least manage the docket. But Trump won't allow. He didn't. The first administration, he's not in this administration. He's removed prosecutorial discretion. So you, as a prosecutor, can't make that call. Well, the standard for this type of application from the judge is really, really high. Person doesn't quite meet it, but they're otherwise good. I'm going to close this case out. You're stripped of that. So that's going to make the docket, both the volume of the docket super high, and then that is going to limit how we deal with the docket. So I don't see how this gets any better.
And like in those cases where you would work it out with the prosecutor, what would the status of that? Would they be granted asylum then? Is that what would happen? They would agree to it?
No, they wouldn't agree to the grant if if the government's attorneys don't feel like you can meet your burden, they're not, if you had other equities, you're paying taxes, you're not breaking the law, you'd have to prove that, you'd have to document these things. They could administratively close your case, which means it remains some level active. So that means the person can essentially continue to receive a work authorization card, which is not true status, but it gives them legitimate documentation because with that work card, you have a social security, et cetera. In other cases, if they just terminate the deportation process, you just revert to being an undocumented person. And because you don't have anything pending with the court, you're no longer eligible for things like work cards, et cetera.
So we're going to talk about criminal law. We kind of like saying, all right, we're going to dismiss your criminal charges without prejudice, meaning we could bring them back anytime we want, but we probably won't. And that's essentially what they're doing. What they were doing in the ones you were able to work out is, we're not going to deport you. We're not giving you asylum. Just be good, and we'll probably won't bring this back up again. But again, now they could, if the Trump administration wanted to, could they make a list of everyone that's gotten that type of deal and say, all right, we're going to actually come back and deport them now? Like, could they do that? Could they bring them
yeah,
new meetings?
good question. They could do it, and they did do it the last time because Obama was the first one who put in or at least, very much prosecutorial discretion has always existed in some form, right? You're a prosecutor, you know that, but the Obama administration really pushed that as a way to manage dockets. So when Trump first came in, what he tried to take the cases that had been in the process of being administratively closed and essentially put them back on the calendar. So cases that have been administratively closed, we could see going back on the calendar, although I'm going to tell you in a second why I think that that would not be smart. For cases that are actually terminated where the deportation case was officially dismissed by the judge, well, you would have to send ICE agents back out to serve them with new charge. It'd be like giving them a new indictment, right? You have to go out and kind of repaper the case and restart the case over. Could they do it? Potentially, yeah, because they have contact information for these folks. But if your stated target is recent arrivals to the United States and national security threats and
Yeah,
aliens with criminal issues,
you don't have unlimited resource.
you don't have unlimited resources and you only have 4 years, and you're not going to get through that list in 4 years.
Right, right. Gotcha. So what happens then? How do they decide how do they decide? And I think this comes into current events too. Where do you reside pending asylum application? Like who decides that? Do you sit in a facility? Now I guess they're letting people sit in Mexico while they wait for asylum applications in the United States. Or are you free at your own free liberty, like in the United States? Like how does that work?
Yeah. Right. So they had remain in Mexico, which is coming back in some type of form, where if you're apprehended at the border and you pass credible fear, but they don't either have the resources to hold you in a jail cell, and they don't want to do what got very popular in the news, we call catch and release, right? We heard a lot about that during the election cycle. They don't want to do a catch and release, then they can have you remain in your country. They can detain you, right? Everybody is eligible to be detained who gets stopped crossing the border. But, if you are, again, if you're not a national security threat, you're not a criminal threat, they will either, or we'll see what's going to happen in the coming months. They'll release you on your own reconnaissance, which would be, provide us an address. You got to check in with the ICE office nearest to where you're saying you're going to live. You have to keep your address updated. You have to go to court. You have to check in with us. And it could literally just be you're checking in, or we're going to, obviously they can, like I said, they could detain somebody in jail. They could put an ankle bracelet on, which we're going to see more of that. But again, there's not unlimited resources for that too, because that just creates its own other cottage industry, right? Just go into the ankle bracelet business,
Yeah.
which are all have guys that were on ICE or part of those boards, and the whole DC thing, right? It's the revolving door. That's what
I retired from ICE and now I started my own ankle bracelet company and I got
right.
a good contract from the government. Oh, that happened.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
hey,
But to answer your
and the judge decides, like, you go in front of a judge and they decide, or is it ICE like given the discretion to make?
It's more ICE really dictating. The judges really don't get involved in that. If ICE decides to say, look, we're going to let you go to New Jersey, but you can't leave New Jersey and you're going to wear this ankle bracelet. When I have a court hearing with that client, I can't say to the judge, can you take this person's a no risk person. Can you take that bracelet off? The judge has no authority.
Okay. So the judge has no, I'll call it bail. The judge doesn't have any say over what the bail conditions are for that person. Like that's really
they do. They do.
They did. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. I'm going to explain.
They can't take the bracelet off.
They can't take the bracelet off. But what the judge can do, if you are detained, like in a facility, you if you're not subject to mandatory detention, which certain people are, ICE thinks you're mandatory detention. You can have that reviewed by a judge, and that's generally going to be based on a prior criminal conviction. But if you are detained by ICE, let's just say you came without a visa or you overstayed a visa and they arrest you at a car wash or something, you have no other disqualifiers, I can request a judge to set bail.
Okay. And you said mandatory detention. Like, tell me more about that.
So mandatory detention, again, its first iteration came in the 90s, and essentially, if you're convicted of an offense that would make you deportable or inadmissible to the United States, which could be, simple possession of a CDS, shoplifting, whatever. Some depending on the grading, how serious it is, but they can statute that if convicted of this type of offense, then detention is mandatory, and so the statutory language says the Attorney General shall detain these individuals. So, which honestly, it was pretty broad in scope from the 90s, really. I mean, I meet people all the time. A lot of what I do is this detain deportation work. It's like, well, can we get bail? No, the answer is can't get bail because of this is the conviction, possession of child porn, whatever it might be. The judge has no authority to release this person. The Lake and Riley Act expanded it beyond convictions to just being charged with crimes, and
Right.
then it expanded the types of crimes that could land you in mandatory detention.
And is that's crimes charged or convictions or crimes charged in the United States and also their home country or anywhere else, right?
Yes. If they can access that information.
I was just going to ask that, like, how easy is it to? I mean, I'm sure certain countries it's probably not that difficult. Like, for example, some of these countries in South America, like how common is it to see, like, oh, here's a rap sheet from Venezuela, like, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's in my 20 years of doing this, it's much more common with your places that are like connected to Interpol, who's then connected to, the FBI and all here. But for some of these, let's be honest, like third world countries, right? It's you're not always going to get that but there are times where ICE does get it, whether or not they may or may not use it in the court deportation process, but they might get it. But it's like anything else, right? You either have to be convicted, warrants have to be issued in your country that are transmitted. I don't know what like the global database for warrants is, but there's something like that.
So just understand that a little bit, like understand the recent act that just passed. If you're charged with a crime, so if you get picked up on, let's say you're in a car of 4 people, they find some drug, there's a car stop for traffic offense. Somehow, some way, it ends up there's drugs found in the center council or somewhere where it's not clear who they belong to. Everyone in the car gets charged. Guy in the back seat, we'll just call him Bob. Bob's undocumented resident of the United States here illegally. What happens then? Does he just get automatically detained because of the new act? Walk me through that.
Sure. So your questions lead to layered answers, which is good. It's good questions, right? So if you are in a state that is non-sanctuary, we'll have to talk about that because New Jersey and Philadelphia are. But if local police calls ICE, right, or let's say you get lodged at a jail and undocumented, so we're going to send a notification to ICE, see if they want to put a detainer on the person. Yeah, ICE is going to come get you and you're going to be in their detention and you're going to go through the deportation process. And unfortunately, if you're charged with crimes that are covered under the Lake and Riley Act, I'm not even going to be able to ask the judge to get Bob bail.
Yeah.
Which means that you stay detained. If you have an application to live here lawfully, you're going to get your day in court, but you're going to be detained for usually around 3 months until you have a final hearing with an immigration judge. So now I'm doing a continuing legal education soon, and one of my categories is Trump versus Murphy. In New Jersey and California, some of these places are trying to, like, quote, I'll use their language, bulwark certain things against federal authority, and immigration is oftentimes one of them, where they want to still continue to go by directives. In New Jersey, what we had was the Immigrant Trust Directive that former Attorney General Gurwal wrote, I guess, but it's really a Murphy administration thing, which said, that we don't want the county jails honoring detainers from ICE. We don't want to notify ICE if we have an individual charged with a crime, which I have to tell you is interesting to me because, I've been practicing long enough to know in the early middle 2000s, New Jersey passed a law requiring on indictable offenses state and local authorities to notify ICE because there had been a guy who was charged, let out, undocumented, who then went out and murdered 3 people in Newark, New Jersey. You're probably a little young for that case, but they then said, oh, mandatory. Now you have to communicate with ICE. And then the trust directive,
The law they passed, you're saying?
Yeah, no, that was an Attorney General directive. But so then New Jersey went the complete opposite way, and to not honor these detainers, which are hold requests when ICE wants to pick up somebody.
personal experience with that. I mean, when I was a prosecutor in Atlanta County, did not have a particular story I'll tell briefly. But even besides that, I have to go back and read directive. I remember though, like they were pretty consistently calling. The prosecutor's offices weren't getting involved, but the jails, they had somebody. They were calling up like, "Hey, we got someone here. You got a detainer." Not sure. I'm not sure exactly the wording that the directive used, but it seemed like there were certain things where they're like, "We're not crossing that line." As far as
The directive was indictable. If a non-citizen was charged with an indictable offense,
right,
then ICE was supposed to be notified, and they
yeah,
were. To your point, they were, and
I think
was picking.
yeah,
ICE was going to the jails, getting those people, and then putting them in the deportation process.
right,
But then we went from transition to, my colleagues were opposed to me because I was opposed to this, but there was such heavy political pressure for counties in the state to end contracts with ICE in terms of detention centers, et cetera. And I said, this is a nice feel good thing, but this only works if all 50 states are going to say we're not going to rent space to ICE to be able to detain. Because now what happens is I have a couple today.
they're all over.
This kid lived his whole life in New Jersey and he's being charged with deportation now. And I'm going to be defending him in New Mexico because they just took him to New Mexico. So you're separating that person from their family during their deportation process because they're not going to be able to visit the person. You're separating them from their evidence and trying to build their case to remain in the United States because the government's initial burden to show somebody is deportable is small. Then the burden shifts on the person in deportation to show that they qualify for whatever type of relief they're pursuing. So, so New Jersey started with, well, we're ending these Essex, Hudson County, they all had contracts with ICE to detain a non-citizen. Middlesex County had one for a long time, but they got rid of them. And then they went another step further with the Immigrant Trust Directive to basically firewall, limit the communication between state and local law enforcement and the feds.
Yeah, I had a case when I was a prosecutor. A guy was charged of pretty significantly injuring his brother-in-law. It was a stabbing. Guy nearly died. And the court had, in the detention hearing, actually released him, but he had a nice detainer. As soon as he was released, police came, picked him up, took him out to like Pennsylvania somewhere. Because again, like you said, they don't have anything in New Jersey. So he's out in Pennsylvania. And, meanwhile, like someone threw it on my desk and said, "Hey, like, can you see if you can get this guy back into New Jersey? Because, it's a pretty serious crime. We really want to prosecute it." And I'm like, okay, like I'll see what I can do. Long story short, I had to reopen the detention. I actually got immigration documents. I had to get all these different documents from the ICE officer, and I had to show like this guy's like immigration history, which he had come into the country, he had been deported, and he had come in again, and they had I don't even remember if they use the old deportation order, because once you have one deportation order, you're basically like, you don't need another one, right?
Correct. What they do is a process called reinstatement. So they essentially just reinstate the prior order. But from the defense attorney side, I had to do the same thing where I got on the case after there was a release at the county level.
Right.
And I didn't want my client trying to present their immigration case with the specter of the criminal charge over them. I want the criminal cases resolved. So in that case, I moved to have my client.
Right. Because you're not resolving a criminal case if you're out in Pennsylvania, right? So,
No.
it's just impossible. You can't do that. So ultimately, I had to reopen. There was a lot back and forth. They detained them. The judge changed there was a different judge actually that changed their mind, detained him, and it was crazy because it seemed as though we weren't going to succeed because the guy was all the way in New Orleans. He was about to get on a plane to get sent back to a South American country.
Guatemala or Honduras? El Salvador?
Honduras, yes, yeah. He was going to be sent back to Honduras, and in the 11th hour, I can't remember how I did it. I got, because ICE wasn't going to bring him back unless there was some assurance that we were going to honor their detainer.
Yeah.
So I had to get, like, I got the jail to put in an email that they would honor the detainer, and then they flew him back. They flew him back from New Orleans, and then he ended up getting detained. But yeah, the intersect there where you have even most of the time you don't see crimes like, because most of the time people get detained on crimes like that, right? But like even like the minor ones, it's almost like you can get charged with like 3 or 4 burglaries, right? Get released, and then you get the ICE detainer, and you never see him in person again. They never get to prosecute these crimes ever, essentially.
Right, which is why when I'm training criminal defense attorneys, and I say, like, look, it goes against your ethos as a criminal defense attorney to not argue to get your client out of custody. But sometimes the best strategic decision is to remain in custody when I don't, when I know that if they get moved to ICE, the immigration judge isn't going to let them out. You're not going to get them back.
They have a pending charge, right? Like, and then it's like, well, they can't even resolve it because it's in another state, and they can't be in front of that. So the courts are, well, they have a pending charge, like, and it's a catch-22 because you can't resolve it.
Right, which led to successful litigation. That case that came out about 10 days ago from the Western District of Pennsylvania, which found that if ICE is detaining the individuals in Moshannon Valley and they have a New Jersey criminal case, that ICE is supposed to make the defendant available for hearings via web portal. So that's a great case for me because we can try to because to your point, right, the majority of these cases are low level. There are a lot that are bad, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are, at the state level, PTI eligible,
Right.
probationary type offenses.
Things you could work out. So things
Yeah.
that like even a U.S. citizen would get some low level, fine or penalty, or like you said, PTI. For those watching, PTI is a diversionary program for first time offenders called pretrial intervention. In that, ultimately, if you're successful, leads to a dismissal. So yeah, right. Like there's most of these cases are result, or they can't be proven, and if you push a little bit, the state will like concede that and either dismiss or give you some sort of like misdemeanor of fine, right? So and I'm sure when you are in those cases, you're making sure that any resolution is not going to be a permanent bar for them to immigrate. We got a little bit more time. Tell me a little bit about the intersection of criminal law and immigration law. Like, what is what different crimes like bar you automatically versus like what do you try to resolve things to that gives at least some chance at discretionary decisions to in the future let the person into the country.
Right. So, so essentially it depends on a person's status, right? If they're undocumented or they've overstayed their visa, a lot more things can impact them. If they're already a permanent resident who's committed a crime, they have a little bit more protection. But essentially, if somebody's a permanent resident, we are looking to fashion a resolution to their criminal case that doesn't hit a criminal ground of deportation. If somebody is undocumented who hopes to have status in the future, permanent status, we're trying to fashion a resolution that we don't hit a criminal ground of admissibility so that they can get their status. There is an enumerated list of aggravated felonies for immigration purposes. These are things like murder, rape, etc., very much specified. But then there's a categories of crimes, which is it's a very nebulous thing. It's called crimes involving moral turpitude. And one man's moral turpitude is not necessarily another man's moral turpitude. It's like what they call crimes of morality, right? So essentially what we're constantly doing is we're looking at the established case law to know if a court in a controlling jurisdiction has said that X crime is a deportable or not. And in a case where there's nothing reported, we're doing our best to break down the statutes to see if it's something that would give them a fighting chance in a potential deportation hearing. So I'll give you a prime example of this is that if you have a firearms offense, right, that is a federal ground of deportation. However, New Jersey has a second-degree firearm and a third-degree firearm. And New Jersey's definition of a firearm is far more expansive than the federal government's. The federal government's really is a Glock is a Glock, right? In New Jersey, a gun can be a BB gun. It can be an air compressed gun. It can be a spring loader. There's many more things. So if you had somebody on a gun case, right, I would be saying, hey, Lou, can you, again, when it's possible, if we can plead this to the third degree over the second degree, not plead as a second, sentence as a third, but we did the third degree, which encompasses all other types of things that can fire a projectile that the feds won't consider a firearm, then I get to go in front of the immigration judge and say that the New Jersey third degree statute isn't a match to the federal statute. Therefore, my client isn't deportable for that. That is a lot of what I do. Criminal defense attorneys ask me to do that for them and advise them on that. But, a lot of my colleagues who are immigration lawyers, unfortunately, are extremely naive about, I'll get calls from people, Derek, my client's charged with fentanyl possession with intent to distribute, and they had a gun. Can you try to plead them to possession of marijuana under 30 grams? It's like, no, I can't. Not when they have, a couple pounds of fentanyl on them,
And no one's gonna agree to that. No.
You got to work within the facts so that you can give a prosecutor something to hang their hat on. So, on the gun cases, we try to do things like either get the third degree if we can, or we try to do the some of the transport laws that are within that statute.
It's also something.
Drugs, we try to get marijuana when we can, but a lot of times
Marijuana's not, they don't deport for marijuana.
you can have a single marijuana conviction under 30 grams, which is tricky because New Jersey's statute is 50 and under to take something from a DP. So we basically have to specify on record. We do this all the time. We recommend.
So you have to
My client had, sir, when you're doing your colloquy with your client, did you have 29.5 grams of?
Yeah.
I think 29.3 is 1 ounce.
Yeah.
Because you need to get to 1 ounce to plead it to the degree that the.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, it looks like we lost Derek there. There he is. Lost there for a second. You were talking about Derek, can you hear me? Yeah, I think he dropped. I mean, we're pretty far. I mean, we got an hour and 10 about, so I'll give a minute or two to log back in.
I think I can hear you again.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can hear you now. We got a lot of time into this, so I mean, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch upon. You're kind of closing out.
Yeah. So like I was saying is, if a prosecutor has a possession with intent to distribute case and they really want it to resolve as an indictable, but I need it to look like a simple possession, uh, the statutory range is 1 ounce to 5 pounds. So if you plead it to 1 ounce, and specify on the record during your plea colloquy under that amount, we'll say the amount of the gram, and that's one way. But but obviously I can't, if you have a client who's charged with a domestic violence, I can't make it look like a trespassing. We have to work within the facts. And I will say I'm appreciative of the criminal defense attorneys who take their obligation seriously, because you do have an obligation to either make sure that client gets accurate immigration advice, right, or that you provide it. And unfortunately, and that's been the law in New Jersey for 15 years now, and still some defense attorneys just want to throw their hands up and say, "Oh, well, you're not a citizen. I don't know what's going to happen. Best of luck." And the defense attorneys have a greater obligation than that, and it is Supreme Court precedent that says it. If a deportation consequence is certain, you as the defense attorney have to be able to say it. And if you don't know that answer, you got to find it. Obviously, the best situation is for that client to hire somebody like me to answer that question, and then try to fashion a resolution that what we call immigration safe. We're trying to give immigration safe, but you're not always going to get that, right? Because if you have something like child pornography, which is very, very common, keep State v. Higginbotham to the side, or the constitutionality of it. But the prosecutor, they do a data poll on somebody's phone, and you got 1,000 images. We're not pleading you to something safe. It's just, it's just, it is what it is.
unfortunately like the least of their concerns
Yeah,
at that point.
absolutely.
I guess let's end with this question. Actually, I have one very minor question,
Okay.
and then we'll end with one other thing. If you plea into PTI, is the deportation? Let's say you plea into PTI on a drug offense,
Mhm.
right? Is it automatically triggered, or is it one of those things where if anybody were to ever pull that transcript and realize you admitted to something, that they could file on you, but from a practical like data input standpoint, it's not going to flag anything because it looks like a dismissal.
So you are correct, but I mean, as a matter of law, pleading into PTI is a conviction for immigration
Right.
purposes, period. But yes, to get to that answer, you'd have to pull transcripts. So that becomes a question of whether or not immigration wants to be bothered to do it. But they
Are they?
they have well they have lawyers, right? So they know that there are the third and fourth degree offenses, your PTI without a plea. They also know that second degree requires prosecutor permission and also an admission. So what would be likely to happen is when that person, say, is traveling after you've done their criminal case and they get dinged coming back in because they have a conviction and they go into a process called secondary inspection. Well, the Border Patrol agents can say, well, I know that this is saying PTI, but we don't know if you admitted. We need everything now, right? So I will tell you, as a practical matter, my clients who had no choice but to plea in to PTI, they have not been subsequently brought into deportation proceedings. But
Yeah.
to me, that's a dicey game. And I would want to be clear with the client and say, look, this may or may not get noticed. You know, if you certain things you do are going to trigger it. You apply for citizenship in the future, you travel, but it is technically a conviction for immigration purposes.
Yeah. So let's end on this. If Derek DeCosmo were overlord of the United States and had free reign to both pass and enforce new immigration law, what would you, in your experience, want to see change or removed, added to our existing framework?
Yeah, I mean, I've alluded to it. I think that one you have to control the number of people coming in through the border, right? Because that has to be. We're a nation. There's security issues that has to be resolved, right? But beyond that, what I would like to see is for people that are here and they're doing the right things, trying to do the right things, that there should be some pathway to becoming permanent residents. And once you've kind of solved your flow problem and your people here, then I would, you know, not necessarily expand the grounds for the family side. You know, I might try to speed up some of the timelines for them, but I would have, you know, labor markets dictate the number of industry per industry, the number of visas that are available each year. You
Yeah.
know, those would be the things that I would do. There's also some silly things in the law that, like for example, you know, let's say I lived here for 10 years and then I get a call that my father is dying in Mexico and I want to see him one last time. So I go and see him and then I come back to the United States. Fast forward a couple years, I got a kid that's in the Marines, and we have a special process in the United States if you have a child who's serving to be able to do your residency. Well, I can't get that person their green card because if you come in the United States more than one time undocumented, you're essentially permanently barred from getting a green card. And that stuff is unnecessarily punishing, and it prevents tens of thousands of people each year from getting their legal status. So I would be removing some of those things. I'm also generally, you know, I generally think for immigration we should necessarily treat criminal issues more harsh than say you as a prosecutor would have treated it. So for these like low level offenses that aren't going to get much more than a slap of a wrist because as society we don't think that they deserve much more than that, you know,
Right.
you shoplift something for $20, you know, I'd like to see less of those things be so devastating from a deportation perspective, you know. So those are some of the changes that I would like to see happen. I do think, and you know, people on my legal side, right, the immigration advocates, I don't think that they will. I think they'll turn their back on President Trump, but I do think Trump is transactional. So I do feel like if he's hitting his deportation targets and the border is secure, I think he, just because he's transactional in nature, that he probably would work out a deal for people here and maybe do something that, you know, we have an illegal immigration problem because our legal process for immigrating is so limited. This whole idea that, oh, I did it the right way, or I can go get in this line, that's a fallacy. And I have to call that out when I hear it. That's just a fallacy. There's not a line for everybody to get into, okay? The lines for things or the categories are not expansive enough to meet the needs of the country. So it really breeds illegal immigration. And then you have, you know, situations where, you know, quite frankly, and I'm pro-immigrant, but the Biden administration so severely mismanaged immigration at every level. Now it appears to people to be a crisis. I don't think it is a crisis in reality, but that perception is so prevalent right now. So you almost can't come to a political solution because the perception is just that things are out of control, and to a large extent, you know, they are. We have not seen these kind of numbers in the history of the country.
Yeah. Well, Derek, thanks for coming on. Always appreciate your viewpoint. I'll be calling you, as I have been, I'm sure, on any future immigration issues, and yeah, we can stop recording now, Tom.
I appreciate you having me.
The best way to follow, subscribe, rate, or message the show is to visit njcriminalpodcast.com.
For more information or to contact Louis Casadia, you can go to lacelaw.com. That's LACELAW.com. To launch a podcast or to upgrade a podcast to video, go to nichepodcastpodcast.com.